Hey, this is Dr. Sho, the Japanese behaviorist. After the dispute some 65 years ago, Chomsky and Skinner finally met again in 2023, in a way. Recently there was an exciting meeting that took place on EnGrama Channel, the meeting between Noam Chomsky and Charles Catania. As a behaviorist, I was so excited about this meeting, and they didn't betray my expectations. They discussed so many inspiring ideas, but for the most part, I thought it was pretty difficult to understand, especially for laypersons. So I just couldn't help but to make a study guide so you can fully appreciate what these two giants in psychology talked about. Big thank you to EnGrama Channel both for hosting this meeting and allowing me to make this video. I put the link to their channel and this Chomsky-Catania video in the description section below. So please check them out. Without further ado, let's dive in.
Noam and Charles, to a new interview to EnGrama. It's a pleasure to have you here again, and we are going to have an interview with both of you. You will introduce yourselves in 1-2 minutes, and then you will have a dialogue about different themes related with psychology, language, behavior, and other things you want to talk about. So we have nothing more to say. I will give you the word, and you can start when you want. So Charles,
okay, Charles.
Start, or Noam?
Okay, well, I guess then I'll start. I think maybe it's appropriate for me to start, mainly because I think most people who watch this would know who Noam Chomsky is. And what I will do is start out a little bit by reminding you, Noam, a little bit about the contact we've had over the years, which has not been extensive. It's just been minimal, but we have had contact over the years.
Let's first talk about who they are. You know Noam Chomsky. He's a pretty well-known linguist and political activist. In psychology, he is best known for overthrowing B.F. Skinner's dominance and became one of the pioneers of the new movement called cognitive psychology. It was some 65 years ago, and that makes Chomsky 94 years old. Can you imagine being this extremely sharp at his age? Simply unbelievable. Charles Catania is a student of B.F. Skinner and one of the most prominent behavior analysts and experimental psychologists of our time. He is best known to the student of psychology as the author of the classic textbook, Learning. Catania is now 87. I mean, how do they do it? They must be using some Korean skincare products or something. Anyway, this meeting is exciting because it is in a way a meeting between Chomsky and Skinner for the first time since their dispute 65 years ago. Let's see what they have to say after so many years of separation.
I was a brand new graduate student at Harvard in the academic year 1958-59. When you came up from MIT to give a talk to the psychology department, and I know that Skinner was in the audience at the time. So I heard you speak very, very early on, at least with respect to my experience. You talked about transformational grammars, you did not mention that you were working on a book review of Skinner's verbal behavior. That came up later on. And then another part of my history that relates to that is that I had been an undergraduate student at Columbia, where I took courses with Fred Keller and Nat Schoenfeld, who had taught a seminar in verbal behavior in which we read Skinner's William James lectures. And during that semester, it was 57, Skinner's book came out. So I was introduced to that as early as I possibly could have been.
Let me comment on this one. Verbal Behavior is the book Skinner wrote to analyze language from the behaviorist point of view. It was published in 1957, and Chomsky wrote a critical review of it in 1959, which signified the downfall of behaviorism and initiated the cognitive revolution. They will talk about what this dispute was later, so let's keep watching.
Have reminiscences from the 50s. I'll add my own. I was a graduate student at Harvard a couple of years before you, early 1950s. I knew about Skinner's verbal behavior. It appeared around the late 40s. It was distributed informally. It was his William James lectures, which came out as verbal behavior about 10 years later. And it was the dominant view in the Cambridge area among those who were interested in what was then called behavioral science. There were a couple of us graduate students who didn't believe any of it. 3, actually. One was Morris Halley, who he and I then went on to establish the linguistics department at MIT. The other was Eric Lenneberg, who went on to, he was a grad student in psychology at Harvard, but the Harvard psychology department in those days was a pretty weird place. There were 3 senior professors. One was Skinner, one was Smitty Stevens, third was George Miller. Skinner and Stevens both knew the absolute truth, but they were opposite truths. And if you were a student of Skinner's, you couldn't take courses with Stevens, and conversely. Well, there were students who weren't really committed to either of the absolute truths. They ended up with George Miller, who was more open-minded, was interested in all sorts of things. So Eric studied with George Miller. George and I later became close friends and colleagues.
Here, Chomsky described the academic atmosphere of the 1950s. The dominant approach in psychology and social sciences in general was behaviorism, and Skinner was the king. Chomsky was young and rebellious. Young researchers like Chomsky wanted something new and groundbreaking, and they challenged Skinner. Chomsky was successful and the situation turned upside down. Chomsky became the reigning king in social sciences for the next 60 years. Behaviorists like Catania, on the other hand, hid underground and continued the resistance.
We were, at the time, early 50s, reading, Eric, Morris, and I were looking at literature which was outside the established canon, mostly European literature on ethology, Tinberg and Lawrence, comparative psychologists in the United States who were outside the canon.
Here they discuss something most people are not familiar with, and that is ethology. Ethology is a study of animal behavior in a natural environment. Why are they talking about ethology? Because they found something interesting that nobody had ever seen before. Between the 1900s and the 1950s, behavioral psychologists generally believed the followings. An organism comes with a set of simple reflexes. Its mind is a blank slate, which is called empiricism. Experience provides associations between environmental stimuli and organisms' reflexes in their mind, which is called associationism. Association is the basis of any complex behavior, which they called learning. This is the famous stimulus-response theory. Pavlov's study of conditioned reflexes with a dog is a good example. What ethologists like Konrad Lorenz and Nicholas Tinbergen found went against the stimulus-response theory. For example, Lorenz conducted a study with geese and discovered what's called imprinting. Imprinting is a phenomenon in which a gooseling identifies the first moving object as its mother right after it hatches. They showed that animals' mind was not a blank slate, nor that they did not need learning to engage in a complex behavior.
Anybody has a computer, look up serial order and behavior, and you'll probably find his name. It's his paper, as far as I could see, this is early 50s, completely undermined behaviorism.
Lashly. Karl Lashly, of course, yes.
Chomsky also talks about Lashly. Karl Lashly was one of the pioneering neuroscientists. In 1951, he published an article, The Problem of Serial Order in Behavior. The idea was that any complex behavior, such as playing piano, cannot be explained as a chain of reflexes. According to the stimulus-response theory, in order to play C, D, E or Do, Re, Mi in succession, the C key on the piano will trigger your forefinger reflex to press C, and then the D key will trigger your middle finger to press D, and then the E key will trigger your ring finger to press E. This makes a chain of reflexes which allows you to play C, D, E. But Lashly pointed out that such a chain of reflexes is too slow. It takes too much time for nerves to send signals from eye to the finger, to the eye, to the finger, to the eye, to the finger. Lashly said there must be another way, something like a central control system that sends a series of orders, such as play CDE, at once, instead of reflexes going back and forth. So the ethologists and neuroscientists challenged the stimulus-response theory, which behaviorists believed. Or at least some people began questioning about it. As Chomsky said, most behavioral researchers back in time didn't seem to pay attention to these studies in the 50s, until Chomsky and others began making noise. What does Catania have to say about this?
But we all did know of him, of his work, and in fact took it very seriously.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
I don't think that any of us who were studying those kinds of things ever thought that words were strung together and a given word had to be the discriminative stimulus for the next word you were going to say. A word like the could be followed by just about anything. And all of us who then worked in those kinds of things, I think, took for granted that yes, you had to know Lashly, and Lashly was correct. And I think that's the idea that chaining was involved, I think, was something that none of us took very seriously. And lately, you'll find that much of the research that people have talked about with respect to sequential behavior involves higher order structured units in which the contiguities of words are really the least important thing about them. So I think we've adopted a lot of those ways of thinking.
actually, there were very few ways of doing database search in those days. You had to do it by hand, but later it was done, and there were no references to Lashly in the psychology literature, tons of references in the neuroscience literature. The first reference to it that I know of was in my review of Skinner, which went to press in 1957, which is why I didn't talk about it. It was already in press. But I did talk about Lashly's paper there, and as far as I know, that's the first reference.
Catania also agrees that stimulus-response theory didn't hold up to the test of time. By the time Catania came to Harvard in 1958, behaviorists were analyzing these ethological findings. All in all, what these studies pointed to was the existence of a controlling system that processes complex sequences of environmental stimuli and executes complex series of actions. Something like a computer. Aha, you see where it's going. This led Chomsky to believe that there is a device in our brain that does this complex computing for language, which he called the language acquisition device, the beginning of cognitive revolution.
And unfortunately, I arrived in 58, and during 58, George Miller, who I had read George Miller's book as an undergraduate student, and I was hoping to spend some time taking courses with him as well as with the others in the department at the time. But he was on sabbatical that year, And by the end of that year, he and Jerry Bruner left the department to form the Cognitive Center. And at that point, people just stopped talking to each other, which I was troubled by, because now you had groups of people who weren't interested in the way things were changing and what each other were doing. And that, I thought, was had unfortunate consequences over the very substantial period of time afterwards.
Very strange atmosphere at Harvard, as I say.
Yeah,
Smith and Skinner not only couldn't talk to each other, but their students couldn't even take each other's courses.
There's one important thing that I need to address here. That is the difference between Chomsky's idea of what behaviorism is and how Catania sees it. When Chomsky talks about behaviorism and behavior theories, he is referring to the stimulus-response theory, which, as I said, is a mixture of classical behaviorism, empiricism, and associationism, which was popular between the 1900s to 1950s. But when Catania talks about behaviorism, he is talking about modern-day behaviorism, which Skinner named radical behaviorism. In the beginning, Skinner was also under the influence of the stimulus-response theory, and it took him some 20 years to get out of this influence. By the time he wrote Verbal Behavior in 1957, his view had evolved into something very different, which Skinner called radical behaviorism. In short, Skinner replaced empiricism with positivism and associationism with functionalism. Catania inherited radical behaviorism. This difference becomes clearer in the following discussion, so let's keep going.
There was nothing in Skinner's verbal behavior that could be salvaged, as far as I could tell. It was, if you took the terms he used literally, it just didn't make any sense. If you used them metaphorically, there were paraphrases of mentalistic terminology. So instead of saying that John wants a cookie, you can say John is reinforced when he gets a cookie. Okay. But it's not telling you anything. And with regard to language, as far as I could see, it was not dealing with the most elementary properties.
Chomsky's understanding of Skinner's verbal behavior is based on his understanding of the stimulus-response theory, so his criticism was largely irrelevant. But we're not getting into that here. What's important here is that in Chomsky's view, Skinner's analysis of language didn't deal with the most elementary property of language, and this is relevant here. It is true that Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior didn't deal with what Chomsky called the most fundamental property of language. But what is it? This is going to be the main topic of discussion for the latter part of this meeting, but for now, they are still on the topic of the stimulus-response theory. So let's keep watching.
We had one graduate student, sadly, he became ill and he didn't continue, but he did this marvelous little experiment in which you start out with ducklings who were just recently hatched, who would become imprinted, and what he could do was to set up a little environment in which you had a little running wheel, and you had a stimulus on a pulley, so that if the duckling ran in the wheel, it either brought the stimulus closer. So, getting close to mommy, if the imprinted, it was often a thing like an empty milk bottle or something, but it wasn't a mama duck, but it functioned that way. And he could hook it up so that the duckling had to run away from mommy. And if the duckling ran away from mommy, it would bring the imprinted stimulus close. If he ran toward her, it would get further away. And then he did another one in which he had a little disc on the wall. And even within the first day or two, you could shape up pecking on that disc. And the duckling would stay and peck at that disc. And that would turn on a light, which would have the mama duckling going back and forth behind this window. And so his conclusion was that it wasn't following that was the crucial thing about the imprinting, because and that sort of makes sense, because the ducklings will paddle in water, they'll walk on land, so, but rather the important thing about the imprinting was it made mommy a big important stimulus, or as the behavioral folks would say, it made it a reinforcer. And once it was a reinforcer, the duckling would do whatever it takes to stay close, to keep mommy close, walk away from it, walk toward her. And I always thought that was a kind of a neat extension, that people who started from that behavioral orientation were now looking at the phenomena that were regarded as crucial, and we had a relationship to talk to the ethological.
Okay, they finally moved on to the 60s. They continued to discuss instinctual behavior that shows that the mind is not a blank slate. Here you can see how modern behaviorists like Catania come to understand phenomena like instinctual behavior. The main difference from the old stimulus-response theory is the positivistic attitude. Modern behaviorists analyze behavior without having any assumptions like empiricism and associationism. You can see more of this in the discussion follow.
This began in the early 60s. There was a lot of interesting work, including Skinner's main students like Keller and Nancy Breland, top animal trainers in the world at the time, trained all the fancy animals, Flipper and so on. But they wrote a very important paper in, I think, about 1962.
Misbehavior of Organisms.
Yeah, Misbehavior of Organisms, in which they talked about what they called instinctual drift, the fact that when you tried to train an animal, you were in fact modifying slightly its instinctive behavior. But when you went on with the experiment, the instinctive behavior took over and the reinforcing stimuli were ignored. So I remember one of their cases was they were trying to teach a pig a trick to pick up a coin and put it in a slot, and then it would get whatever pigs like, a pellet of something. Yeah. And it all worked exactly as it was supposed to. They did the right schedule of reinforcement, and pig played the trick. But after a while, they found that the pig was slowing down. It was not going to put the pellet in the thing in the slot. It was just
rooting,
starting to starve. Would starve to death. What they finally found was that the experimenters, they thought that the pig was picking up the thing and putting it in the slot, but the pig thought it was rooting. That's the pig's instinctive behavior. You root to get food. And when it got hungry, it just rooted harder and harder and delayed the reinforcement longer and longer. And as I say, it would have starved to death just because the instinctive behavior was taking over.
Here, Chomsky mentioned Breland and Breland's 1962 report, The Misbehavior of Organisms. Let me talk about this report because this is a classic. One of the main components of any behavioral theory is the concept of a reinforcer. Thorndike, who proposed this concept in 1898, defined a reinforcer as a pleasant or a rewarding consequence that strengthens behavior. For example, water, food, sex were considered reinforcers. Keller and Marian Breland were a couple who studied under Skinner and later became the animal training guru. What Breland reported in their 1962 paper was that they could not train some animals using food as a reinforcer. Chomsky here talked about a pig. Another example was the raccoon. When Breland attempted to train a raccoon to put a coin into a piggy box, the raccoon picks up the coin, but it had difficulty releasing it into the box. Instead, raccoon began watching the coin and wouldn't want to give up the coin for food as an exchange. Breland had to give up training the raccoon for their show business. What's the big deal? Their report pointed out that a reinforcer could not control the raccoon's behavior because the raccoon's instinct took over. This was a scandal because the reinforcer, which is the fundamental building block of behaviorist theories, failed. The biggest flaw in the behaviorist theories. Or not. Let's see what Catania has to say.
The person who made the biggest difference with respect to all that stuff was Dave Premack. Are you familiar with Dave Premack's name? Or Dave was at Minnesota, and he also went on later to do work with chimps and all and language. But before he got around to that, his big what we call the Premack Principle was that the higher probability behavior will reinforce the lower probability behavior. And so if you had, for example, a raccoon and you give the raccoon some food, but there's no water nearby, the raccoon can't wash that food, and yet that's part of the pattern. And so what you usually find is that there's a hierarchy in which you can use, for example, with those pigs, you could use the opportunity to root to reinforce putting the coin in the slot. But people didn't think of doing that. And in those days, and by the way, Skinner was never quite comfortable with Premack and with the Premack Principle, and didn't kind of think about the reversibility. But if you have a water-deprived rat that's had plenty of food, you can get it to eat in order to get something to drink. But on the other hand, if it's had plenty to drink but it hasn't had food, you can get it to drink in order to eat, and you can make it go either way. And I think the resolution over the years has been that we now see that lots of that ethological stuff essentially tells you what the dominant behavior is, and that's given by genetic histories and things that are important in the ecology of these different creatures, and will be different for all of them. But I think we've come to a point where we can see how, again, it satisfies me because it's a way of bringing these things in which people have been opposed to each other and showing that we can have a common way of thinking and talking about them.
Catania gives a modern-day behaviorist analysis of Breland's report. He first brought up Premack. Let me explain why Premack is important. To recap, the issue was that a raccoon's instinct was stronger than the power of a reinforcer to control behavior, the fatal flaw in operant conditioning. Here is what Premack demonstrated. He put a wheel and a water bottle in the rat's cage. When Premack blocked access to a water bottle, he was able to use water as a reinforcer to make the rat run on the wheel. This is a no-brainer, right? Water is a reinforcer, and the wheel running is a task to get water as a reward. Next, Premack reversed the water bottle and the wheel relation. He restricted access to the wheel, and the water was free to drink. Naturally, the rat drank as much as he wanted, and he didn't care about water anymore. But now the rat wanted to run on the wheel, but the wheel was locked. What Premack did then was that he said to the rat, "If you drink more water, I will unlock the wheel." He didn't actually talk to the rat, but that was the arrangement. Then what happened was that the rat drank water more in order to run on the wheel. Premack was able to use both the water and wheel as reinforcers to control the rat's behavior. What's the punchline? The punchline is that a reinforcer is not defined by its physical property, but it's defined by its function. Physical characteristics like food, water, sex, and so on do not decide whether an item works as a reinforcer. You can call something a reinforcer only when it controls behavior. The misunderstanding of Breland's report happens when people suppose food as a reinforcer. Food was not a reinforcer for the raccoon. Washing the coin was a reinforcer. And it was not that instinct won over a reinforcer. It was that washing coin worked as a reinforcer instead of food. By the way, this misunderstanding still occurs today in the field of clinical psychology, education, and parenting. People who are against behavior therapy and applied behavior analysis automatically assume money, candies, stickers, tokens, and praise are reinforcers. They say that you cannot motivate people with those items, or that motivating students with these items are unethical. Well, these people are still living in the 1950s. They misunderstand that a physical characteristic of an item decides what a reinforcer is. But it doesn't. Everyone is motivated by different things at different times. If you want to use a behavioral approach to your students, you better be sensitive to your students' individual needs. And this is one of the major developments in Skinner's radical behaviorism. Stimuli in the environment, like reinforcers and behavior of the organisms, are functionally related to each other, not by their physical appearances like the old stimulus-response theories once believed.
I think there is one still major separation within the field of learning, and that is, I think, between the people who, and I fall in this category, who look at a lot of behavior in terms of selection. That is, in ontogeny, you think of an organism as being this population of lots of different bits of behavior, and some of them produce certain consequences and they continue on, and others fall by the wayside. And so selection is sort of the dominant way of thinking about things. And on the other side, and this is especially true in the British folks coming out of the Oxford, Cambridge axis, and who are still thinking in terms mainly of associations. And I think that does separate people. I think and I like to think of associations as being things that get selected along with a lot of other kinds of things that can be selected. So I tend to think of it as being more general and encompassing both. I think we have a ways to go to somehow find the ways in which to connect those. There are a couple of people who have models which show that both reinforcement phenomena and conditioning phenomena could be reduced to similar kinds of neural systems and so forth. And so I think we have ways to go there.
Here, Catania briefly talks about another feature of radical behaviorism, which is selectionism. As we discussed earlier, the stimulus-response theory assumed that an organism learns by association in the mind. That is, a stimulus like the golden arch is associated with French fries. French fries trigger saliva in your mouth as a stimulus-reflex relation. Now the golden arch and saliva reflex is associated in your mind. This association causes you to have water in your mouth whenever you see the golden arch. As we have seen through this discussion, this associationism idea didn't really work. Chomsky and Lashly before him came to suggest that there is a much more sophisticated machinery in our brain that can do this job. How about Skinner and modern-day behaviorists deal with this issue? One of the things that they did was to distinguish between learning and performance. Whatever happens in the brain, whether it is an association or learning or computation, is a subject of study for neuroscientists. The job of the psychologists is to study behavior in relation to the environmental causes. Modern-day behaviorists say that no matter what is happening in the brain, when it comes out as behavior, it is subjected to the laws of behavior and there is no escaping from it. We can learn behavior without getting into neuroscience. This is like a difference between physics and chemistry. No matter what the underlying mechanisms of atomic and subatomic particles are, chemical phenomena still follow the laws of chemistry, and these laws can be studied and discovered without knowing the particle physics. But how can we talk about behavior without talking about learning? Catania brings up the idea of natural selection. Just like Darwin's concept of natural selection, where the environment selects which species of organisms to survive and go extinct, modern-day behaviorists conceptualize that the environment selects certain behavior to survive and others to go extinct. For example, no matter how you learn a language, what you say and when you say it are up to who you are talking to and when, which is your environment. The environment selects what you say and not to say. Darwin was able to articulate the process of natural selection without the knowledge of DNA and heredity. Modern-day behaviorists can do the same for the behavior of organisms, while neuroscientists can figure out how organisms learn.
My own feeling is that in the longer term, the concept of learning is going to essentially disappear, be recognized to be not a proper category of development and ontogeny. I mean, if you think about it, every kind of change in an organism from conception to death involves all of the three possible factors that enter into organism change. One is the internal structure of the organism. Originally, its innate capacities changing through time. Second is the whatever stimuli there are. Third is laws of nature, which simply require that things develop in certain patterns and not others. This is developed in biology as well. And if the innate capacity has a larger role, you call it growth. If stimuli have a larger role, you call it learning, but there's really no boundary. It's just a mixture of all three at every point. This is growth and development. That's why the study of language learning has been called language acquisition.
I don't know whether I should do this or not, but
learn.
this is the name of one of my, and it's too big and it's too old and it's obsolete now, but I am pleased in response to what you just said to be able to say that the first paragraph is, what is learning? And then I go through a list of things and then say in the end, no, we can't define learning. It is just a colloquial term and it encompasses so many different things that there's nothing that all instances of learning have in common that's useful to us. So, but you have to call the book something. and this was the last edition. It's now, I think, obsolete, but I'm amused that we agree on that totally.
It is actually interesting that Chomsky came to this conclusion because this was the very idea of Skinner in 1950. Skinner replaced the word learning with behavior change to remove any kind of assumptions attached to the word learning, such as associationism. Chomsky summarized Skinner's point very well. It's interesting they came to the similar conclusion in the end. Okay, we are halfway there. This is already a lot of information and enough about behaviorism. Now the discussion turns to Chomsky's idea of language. So hang in there.
But in any case, one of the other things that I've worried about a bit over the years is the poverty of the stimulus. And let me try this out to be sure that my understanding of the way you introduced the idea of the poverty of the stimulus was that the child has to be exposed somehow to these contrasts, including some things that are totally ungrammatical and would never, but some of these the child will never have heard. But because of the way the language is structured and organized, if the child should be exposed to this, the child will recognize this as an ungrammatical sentence. Yet there's many kinds of learning phenomena that people have studied in which you don't need you don't need to be exposed to many of the negative instances. It only takes one contrast. So, for example, if you let me use as the example the spectrum. You can raise a duckling in monochromatic light, so it never sees anything but this one yellow. And then after it's had that training, after it's had that history, it's never seen different colors, unless maybe there is some contrast effects that come out. But you now teach it to peck a disc when the key is yellow and not to peck the disc when the key is blue. And what you'll find is its pecking then is in an orderly way responsive to the entire spectrum. So that just creating that one contrast between two colors is enough to then tap into the structure of the spectrum. Is that a decent analogy to the kinds of things you'd say about grammatical structure? That you get a couple of examples, and because of the structure of these particular utterances, you will have an orderly set of relations among the ones, including those you haven't even ever heard before?
Well, the examples of the ungrammatical sentences were just illustrations of the fact that poverty of stimulus is overwhelming. The child doesn't use negative examples in acquiring a language.
Yeah. Okay.
In fact, there's pretty good evidence by now that children learn language from positive examples only. They don't pay attention to corrections. If you've had a young child, you've had that experience, just ignores when you try to correct it. It just pays attention to whatever data is going on in the ambient language, and its instinctive capacities just create a language out of it. But poverty of stimulus is so overwhelming that you just don't need evidence for it anymore.
What Catania is asking here is Chomsky's idea of the poverty of the stimulus. When children learn the language, they can learn pretty well despite the lack of enough examples. Again, this idea is a criticism of the empiricist notion of the blank slate of the mind. If the mind is a blank slate, you can only speak what you've heard before. But Chomsky pointed out that children can generate sentences much more than what they have heard in their lives. This undermines the empiricist notion of the blank slate as well as the stimulus response theory. Catania here is asking whether this is because humans have a module, similar to a visual system. The visual system is prepared to see different colors and shapes even when you have never seen a particular color or shape in your life before, because the visual system doesn't need the experience. And Chomsky's answer is yes. Chomsky theorizes that humans have an apparatus called the language acquisition device that is innate in the brain. What you need to do is to turn on this device, and the device automatically gets the language right for you despite the poverty of the stimulus.
May I assume we're mainly talking about grammatical structure and not things like vocabulary, where the vocabulary really has to depend upon the experience within this speak community, because if the words aren't there, you're not going to learn words you can extend.
Yeah, that's the paradigm example. But even that example doesn't work for the reasons I mentioned. So if you want to know whether that thing over there is called tree, you have to have in your mind already coded in your brain before this experience altogether. You have to have the set of possible phonological forms, which is very narrow and restricted. That's given by nature. You have to have the set of concepts, all given by nature. And the one thing you learn is pretty trivial. Just associate this possible form with this possible concept. Now you can learn that in 2 or 3 presentations. But then all the rich knowledge about the meaning of the word, and the pronunciation of the word is already available. In fact, Gleitman's work has actually shown that a couple of presentations, 2 or 3, is enough for the child to acquire the sound meaning correspondence and know the nature of the word with all of its richness and complexity.
Well, there is some behavioral people doing similar kinds of things.
Paradigmatic case of learning involves extremely rich innate structure. And more than that, the laws of phonology themselves are determined in part by just computational efficiency principle.
Catania here asks about vocabulary because vocabulary is something that we don't have when we are born. The language acquisition device doesn't come with a list of words. We can only learn from other people. Catania, as a behaviorist, is interested in this aspect of language, but Chomsky isn't. Chomsky thinks learning words is trivial. For Chomsky, both the ability to put phonological sounds together to make a word and the ability to perceive objects, concepts, and ideas are both innate. So learning words means connecting the sound and the object together, which, according to Chomsky, is a trivial matter. Here I cannot help but point out how Chomsky presents his ideas so well in the discussion. He doesn't deal with every single point that Catania brings up. He just says those are trivial and move on to present what he thinks is important, which is kind of reminds me of how Skinner was. And we should probably learn how to talk like him. Anyway, Catania obviously is interested in how people learn different words, because that's what behaviorists are interested in. Chomsky is only interested in how these innate capacities are structured. This is like saying humans have legs. Chomsky is only interested in how the legs are structured, whereas Catania is interested in how they are used in, say, football, dance, and so on. Chomsky dismisses the use as trivial, and this attitude gets clearer as the discussion goes on. So let's continue.
But they're going to be different in different languages, right? So what about the where I have trouble thinking these kinds of things through is what are the natural things that would be involved if you're talking about the different kinds of phonology you have, say, if somebody's learning Dutch or if somebody's learning Japanese or Chinese. In Chinese, you've got the tonal differences, which I have a colleague, actually he's an engineer, but I talked to him, and he's now learning Mandarin, and he's talking about the trouble he's having hearing the tonal differences. There's a little bit of tonal stuff in Norwegian, but not much. In most European languages, we don't worry about it. But each of the children who are being raised in these different communities is getting exposed to different kinds of things. And so what is the universe, when you're saying that these are given somehow?
Kudos to Catania for mentioning Japanese here. Catania, as a behaviorist, is not happy about Chomsky's innatism idea of language and brought up the differences in languages across cultures. If in fact, as Chomsky said, our language capability is so limited by the language acquisition device, why do we have such a wide range of languages across cultures? This is one of the main criticisms of Chomsky's innatism idea of language. How does Chomsky respond?
What are the universals with respect to, say, phonetics, which varies so?
Even with regard to phonetics, the universal principles are very profound. There are very few options among all the sound structures that you can imagine. There's an extremely narrow range of options that the child immediately hits upon to say, this is language. You take a newborn infant, it hears all kinds of noise. For a chimpanzee, that's just noise, it remains noise. But the child instantly, at the very beginning, picks out the parts of the noise that are language related. and
maybe even prenatally, I understand.
them in kind of a fixed structure of possible phonological structures. So take the Japanese English case. By about 10 months, a Japanese infant no longer distinguishes R and L. And by about the same period, an English-speaking influence doesn't distinguish Arabic emphatic, non-emphatic consonants. All of this stuff works.
Or the B versus P in Arabic, right?
Yeah, right. All of this goes by a pre-programmed innate structure, very similar to a child acquiring the ability to walk. We don't say a child learns to walk. It just develops walking as part of its maturational development. And very much the same seems to be true of development of even phonetics. When you get into grammatical structure and like that, the universals are far deeper and the possible ranges are far left. By now it's becoming.
Thank you, Chomsky, for mentioning Japanese here too. What does Chomsky say? The difference in languages across cultures is trivial. For him, what is important is the machinery that makes any kind of languages possible. A pre-programmed innate structure, a universal language device. As you can see me speaking English with an accent, I personally don't think the difference is trivial. In my experience, it is not just a matter of L and R sounds that differ between Japanese and English, but the use of the whole body structures like mouth, lips, tongue, teeth, throat, face, and hands are completely different between Japanese and English. It's almost like playing two different sports like football and soccer. Of course, if I were to learn English when I was 10, I would have been able to speak like a native speaker. But is that just a matter of the language device? Let's see what Chomsky has in mind.
Phonetics, that's just said immediately. And notice incidentally that the phonetics is basically irrelevant to language. A deaf child will learn sign, no phonetics, and have perfect.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at the way we now pretty well understand that what we call language has two almost totally different components. One part is an internal computational system, which basically yields what we call meaning, basically yields thought. Our thoughts are just constructed by fixed internal principles of grammatical structure. Then there's a second part that we call language, which is externalization, mapping this internal thing into some sensory motor medium. But that's quite separate. If you want an analogy, it's something like you have a computer program in your laptop, maybe for calculation. You can hook it up to one or another printer. The internal system doesn't care what printer you hook it up to. Seems to be pretty much the way language works. The internal system is just fixed, coded internally. You have no conscious awareness of it. It's all going on, inaccessible to consciousness. And then it gets externalized into one or another sensory motor medium. Usually sound, can be sight, can even be touch. It's not smell because we don't have enough.
Here, Chomsky says phonetics is irrelevant to language because deaf people can learn sign language. This is really important. He goes on and says language has two components. 1, an internal computational system. 2, externalization. In a way, the internal computational system is the computer software and the externalization is the hardware. We can see the heart of cognitism in there. Chomsky says externalization is not important in language. That is, our sensory and perceptual systems are not essential to language, nor are the motor systems. These are the hardware issues of the computer. What's important is the software, which is the language acquisition device.
But notice that all of this is externalization. In the case of language, there's a lot of structure to the sensory motor systems. The visual and gestural systems have their own structure. The articulatory system has its own structure. The perceptual auditory system has its own structure. None of this has anything to do with language. All of these systems were in place long before language ever emerged, and they haven't changed at all with the appearance of language. So these are just like a printer attached to your laptop. They're basically they're non-linguistic systems. In fact, even the fact that language is produced word after word has nothing to do with language. The internal system is unordered. You can show that. The internal system that generates thoughts has no order. The order is imposed by a non-linguistic articulatory system, which is unable to produce structures, so it has to produce them word by word. Process of linearization actually is outside of language. It's a property of sensory motor systems that were there long before language appeared and have.
Now he gets deeper into his idea of language. He says that both sensory and perceptual systems and motor systems developed long before the language system did on the evolutionary scale. What does this mean? This means that we share pretty much all of our biological systems, sensory, perceptual, and motor systems, with our ancestry species and sibling species, such as microorganisms, fish, mammals, and apes. They all have sensory, perceptual, and motor systems just like ours. What they don't have is a language system. The language system evolved much later than other systems. Therefore, according to Chomsky, language is not related to other systems. So then, what is this internal system Chomsky is talking about?
Before the emergence of modern humans, you get some marks and shells and stuff, but basically nothing. After the emergence of humans, you pretty quickly get very complex symbolic activity and complex societies and so on. Put all this together, it looks as though the language capacity developed pretty much along with modern humans. It must have been some slight rewiring of the brain that gave the basic property of language, which is the property of recursive enumeration of a digital infinity of structured expressions.
Chomsky says the internal computational system is the property of recursive enumeration of a digitally infinite set. That's a big word. Let's break it down. By the way, I'm not a linguist, so if you are a linguist, please let me know if my understanding is correct in the comment section below. First, let's summarize what Chomsky has been saying about language so far. Here are the things Chomsky says are not language: sounds, words, pronunciations, gestures, cultural differences, visual presentations, the usages of language, sensory, perceptual, and motor systems, and they're all trivial problems. Okay, after we remove all these aspects of language, what's left? According to Chomsky, only the structure of language is left. What kind of structure? A syntax, a grammar, a logical structure, just like a mathematical equation or a computer program. What are the characteristics of this structure? This structure is the basis of all languages on Earth. It is a universal grammar. All the languages are produced by the same rules specified by this structure. It is generative. What rules are there? The rules are the recursive enumeration of a digitally infinite set. Okay, let's work this out. The first feature is that the simplest syntax structure is a combination of the noun phrase and the verb phrase. For example, the noun phrase is John, and the verb phrase is run. The combination is John runs. The second feature is recursion. Recursion is a feature that any sentence structure is built from a combination of the noun phrase and the verb phrase, and this combination can add up forever. That means you can keep putting this noun-verb combination one after another in one sentence, just like a Russian doll. This repetitive feature is called recursion. For example, John runs can expand to John runs to the park, to John runs to the park where Kim runs, to John runs to the park where Kim runs after John arrives, to John runs to the park where Kim runs after John arrives so that John and Kim runs together, and so on and on. This recursion rule is important not only because it can produce an infinitely long sentence, but also because it can produce an infinite number of different sentences. Chomsky says only humans can do this. The third feature is enumeration of digitally infinite set. Enumeration means a list of words. Digitally infinite set is the idea that you can use a finite set of words to produce an infinite combination of words. Okay, now let's translate the property of recursive enumeration of a digitally infinite set into what we just went through. It becomes something like this. Language is a repeatable set of a finite number of words that can produce an infinite number of word combinations as sentences. Did you get it? To make it a bit easier, for Chomsky, language is this internal algorithm or computer program that can generate any grammatically correct sentences from a list of words. This is like playing piano. There are only a limited amount of keys on the piano, but the music you can write is infinite. This infinity is the most important feature of language, according to Chomsky, because only humans have this ability.
You take a piano. Keys begin, keys end. You know there are 88 of them. Nobody can tell you any different. They are not infinite. You are infinite.
By the way, Chomsky proposed this idea in 1957, when he was only 29. What a genius.
And we should dismiss the stories that are produced about what might have happened, yet anything might have happened.
But language had to have some kind of function for it to have, so let me, what I'd like to do at this point is to describe a set of a body of research on verbal behavior that is about the functions of language. And you've talked about structure quite a bit, not so much about what language does. And of course, what language has got to be part of in some ways, it's social behavior. And as far as I can tell, I have not been able to come up with any function of language that is an irreducible function other than we came up with this really elegant way in which one individual can get another individual to do something. And some other organisms do a little of that, but we do it in an amazingly varied way. And we see it happening in politics, and we see it happening in all kinds of areas. I mean, it's one of the things that kept coming back to me as we went through our political turmoil in recent years was that the idea that language is rational is a very limited value when you see what politicians can do with words and how the words don't have to have any consistent relationships with the way things are in the world.
Catania here asks the function of language. As a behaviorist, Catania believes that the function of language is important. Function here means its use. The legs have structure and function. The function of the legs is to walk, dance, run, kick, and so on. The use of legs depends on environmental demands. Modern-day behaviorists believe there are laws governing how we use language as verbal behavior.
Most of my life is devoted to these questions.
Yeah.
But these are totally separate.
Oh, I grant you that.
Of the nature and origin of language. There's some important things to remember about evolution, which are often overlooked. Evolution, the process of evolution, pays almost no attention to function. So if you schematically look at evolution, how does it work? You have some system, maybe bacteria, and some accidental event takes place which disrupts the system. Could be a mutation, could be genetic drift, could be gene transfer. It could be, in fact, sometimes is one microorganism accidentally swallowing another, which happens to be what led to the development of eukaryotic complex cells, us. Otherwise, we'd all be bacteria if that hadn't happened. So you have some accidental event that takes place. Then nature comes along and develops the optimal analysis, the optimal structure for that new system, just the way physics determines that when bees poke through a substance, it becomes hexagons. They're not trying to make hexagons. It's physics that does that. And the same is true of evolution. So the first stage is just some random event. Second stage is nature structuring this in the optimal fashion. And the third stage is natural selection. Those that reproduce more tend to stick around. But at the second stage, constructing the system, nature hasn't any idea what the function is going to be.
Well, of course not.
Things are not created because of a function. So, for example, and that's true of everything, language and everything else. So I use my fingers to type, but nature had no knowledge of that when it developed fingers. And the same is true of evolution generally. So functions only appear at the third stage when you're getting reproductive success. Now, in the case of language, it looks as if the third stage was never reached, maybe because of lack of time. But as far as we know, all humans, no matter how separate they are, have exactly the same faculty of language and cognitive faculties generally. It seems like humans have very little genetic variation, very slight. And the faculty of language, other cognitive capacities seem to be shared completely. So it looks as if the third stage of natural selection was never reached for language. Only the second stage of constructing the simplest possible system once some disruption took place. So a possible scenario is that some minor rewiring of the brain yielded recursive enumeration of digital infinity. Then nature constructed the simplest possible system for the internal language, the language of thought. Then when you get to the externalization, you have to ask, how do you relate this to systems that have been around for millions of years and have nothing to do with language? And that's where you get the phonetic questions and the questions of gesture and sign and so on. But remember, they are not linguistic questions. They are questions about systems that have no connection with language. But we have to basically make a distinction that actually goes back to Aristotle between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. Those are very different things. Study of the structure and nature of a system is possession. Use is a different story. and it involves all sorts of other things. So these are just two different enterprises.
And you know by now how Chomsky responds. It's trivial. He thinks externalization is not the core of the language. And he brings up a very interesting argument here. He says evolution pays no attention to function. What does he mean by that? Let's briefly go over the evolutionary process. First, an organism's biological makeups change by accident. This is called mutation. Second, if the mutation doesn't kill the organism, and if the mutated individual can reproduce offspring, this mutation can be passed on to the children. Third, if this mutation provides some benefits to this organism and its offspring, this family survives while other members of the same species may go extinct. This is natural selection. Fourth, this mutated organism's lineage becomes a new species. So what Chomsky is saying here is that at first, when humans acquired this internal computational system as language in the past, it was just a mutation. A mutation is aimless. It was just an accident, no function, no purpose. As in the second phase of the evolution, this mutation didn't kill humans, so we passed this mutation down to the next generations. But Chomsky thinks humans have not moved to the third phase where natural selection will decide whether our language ability is advantageous for the survival of our species or not. Therefore, the function or the use of language is still not an issue. Here you can see Catania and Chomsky have different concepts of the word function. Catania is using it in terms of ontogeny, which is the lifespan of individuals. What we say and what we don't say are subject to natural selection. You can tell a joke to your friend, but not to your mom. It's an ontogenic natural selection. On the other hand, Chomsky is using the word function in terms of phylogeny, which is the lifespan of species. As a species, Chomsky thinks humans are not tested by the environment. Chomsky's idea is very interesting, but I'm not sure if his idea makes sense here. He also talks about the fact that all subhuman species that went extinct didn't show language. And if that's the case, it's conceivable that only modern humans survived this environment because of this unique feature, which is pretty much what natural selection does. But I have to do more research on this topic to analyze Chomsky's claim. If you know about this line of research, please let me know.
Do you think it's going to turn out it was a lethal mutation in the direction in which we're going in politics?
I think there's very good reason to believe that. There's very good reason to believe that higher intelligence altogether, what we call higher intelligence, is a lethal mutation. Fermi's paradox bears on this. You know what this is? Enrico Fermi, great astrophysicist, asked one simple question: where are they? How come, with all the massive efforts to find some sign of intelligent life somewhere, we come up with nothing? He recognized, as a distinguished astrophysicist, that there's innumerable number of planets that share enough of the properties of Earth so that they could have developed intelligent life. So why don't we hear anything from them? Well, when he brought this question up, John von Neumann, great mathematician, apparently answered that any intelligent life would develop nuclear energy and they would destroy themselves by radiation. So they're not around. Others have speculated otherwise. But if we look at current human behavior, the way we're dealing with the impending climate crisis, for example, it does look as if there's an unbridgeable gap between our technical capacity to destroy and our moral capacity to overcome it. And that might be the reason why we never hear any indication of any other intelligent life. It's just a lethal mutation. We're trying to show that right now.
Lastly, they discuss whether this language ability is beneficial to humans as a species. They say this could be a fatal mutation in the long term. Language, or our cognitive ability in general, is both making us successful and putting us at risk of extinction. Both Catania and Chomsky don't have much hope in the future of human species. Okay, this is the end of this study guide. Congratulations if you are still watching this video. It was a long ride. I mean, it was a very exciting and insightful discussion, but man, it was a lot of information to unpack. Both Chomsky and Catania were just incredible, and we are so lucky to see them talk to each other in 2023. Thank you again, EnGrama Channel, for this meeting and allowing me to make this video. I hope you got some interesting insights and ideas from this video. Thank you for watching, and let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I will see you in the next video. ありがとうございました。